Beautiful chairs, I think they're very fitting for the environment. Really.
I think they contrast even my works. I try to create something.
Yes, which is very interesting actually, because they're obviously chairs are found objects, but you use found objects in your work quite profusely. I've been now following your work for a couple of years, and this idea of the found object has become so like a main component in your work that it's almost like you're using whatever objects you find as a stylistic language of sorts. It's your vocabulary. And what's most striking about these, in my opinion, is that you're not only just using found objects, but you're almost creating blueprints of them. You're translating them into sort of binary, even the black and white and the red sort of markings. It's a bit like looking at a binary code, which is then marked or annotated.
Yes.
And it goes on to feeling a bit like these blueprints from various found objects are then brought together to present or suggest something new, and I'm not entirely sure what that is, and I think that's the point.
Yes, in fact, even I'm not fully aware of what's going on, sort of, I'm always remembering what one of Picasso's artists has said about his demos in Avignon. He said that it was like sort of drinking petrol. No one actually knows how.
Exactly, and that's what's happening. I think that's the beautiful thing about it, that you get to a point where, as you're creating, you feel you're also exploring and you're also understanding.
It's an exploration of ideas, and it's a path that you also you're very aware. You're aware about it, even as a creative. And it's a point in my life that I've been to the cemetery I told you before, and this marble gravestone struck me, and it just started 3 years ago.
Which is remarkable, really, because when I walked in, the first thing I said was that I had forgotten the technique of rubbing. I had forgotten it existed, whereas it's the first thing we're taught as students when we're in primary school. So as I walked in, it's like you're going back to primitivism, not in the violent sense, but in the sort of tactile. When we're born, the first senses we rely on our touch and taste and smell. They're not visual or auditory, and there's a heightened sense of that. There's a heightened awareness of that in all of these works, which is quite remarkable, because I feel like perhaps for the first time, at least from the works I've seen, this is possibly the first series of works which is moving onto the tactile and not the visual.
Yes. In fact, all of us are now, we're surrounded with technology and screens and stuff, and I think it is. I think I find it urgent that we go back to the senses.
Yes. Which is quite remarkable, because it's so very difficult to portray symbols and express things which are symbolic at the very core meaning of it. It's pure symbols, an asterisk, an arrow. Yet, going through a methodological route which is tactile.
Yes.
So you're sort of relaying something which is purely visual through tactile means. So it's quite remarkable, especially the big works. And I think that's why they're particularly striking, because as you're looking at them, you can almost picture yourself, picture the artist
doing that,
grabbing the roll of paper, placing it over the object and drawing it, so it becomes, it's almost a documentation of a performance, no?
It is. It is. In fact, I try to document it even as an action, as photos and even footages, and because I think it's part of the action itself is part of the creation itself. I mean, as you know, because I also follow your work, I know how conceptual it's also becoming now. And the fact that the end result is somehow secondary to the original concept or concepts.
In fact, when you look at these series, it's exactly like you've said. The end result is sort of takes a back seat. It's not so important. It's an act of inscribing. So you're using your tools to sort of mark a particular moment or particular action, and it's quite beautiful when you think about it, because the action itself is marking the paper, so it's almost like a 360, no?
Yes. And as you mentioned, it reminds us of our first experiments with rubbing at school, coins and leaves, and that I think is what makes the works stand out. You never shy away from using even the most basic or the most disregarded of tools, materials, markers, paper, graphite, and you don't shy away from using it in a sort of academic, artistic context traditionally, because you go back to primary school, you go back to elementary, you go back to what it is that we tend to do, and we have paper at hand and charcoal paper. Practically, the first two objects or art materials that we're familiar with, sort of at primary. And as you were saying, that element of going back and even somehow nostalgic.
Exactly, so that takes us back to the subject matter of the work it is, which is looking back, which is nostalgia, memory, and perhaps how memories exist in fragments.
Exactly, because they're like a juxtaposition of fragments.
And to be honest, when we try to even depict or portray or sort of explain events which are embedded in our memory, even if we try to be as truthful or as honest as possible, it's never possible. So
memory is what it is, it's fragmented.
It's fragmented, it's sort of embedded in our minds through code, and sometimes we start editing it and keeping what we like and doing away with what we don't like. It's how the human psyche works. No, we try to, as much as possible, delete what doesn't serve us. So we try to delete all of the bad code. We dispose of it, we recycle it.
Interesting observation.
So obviously, everything exists in fragments, and that's perhaps why nostalgia as a concept in art is also very problematic, because you're longing for a place, you're longing for a time, or you're longing for a state or an object which
maybe we don't know.
Exactly, it's not exactly truthful, or maybe has never existed, because our minds tend to play tricks and they distort things, and it's so beautiful to see these distortions on paper. You said you were sort of trying to map out and create blueprints out of various tombstones, for example. So already a tombstone is something that almost, in a very flowery way, does away with all of the bad, all of the irrelevancies, and only serves to remember the beautiful aspects, the beauty of someone. So already a tombstone is the symbol of it already dishonest almost. It's already, and then you're taking note of that. Sorry if I'm reading too much into the word.
Sort of recoding or
decoding. Exactly. I think that's the word, decoding, almost trying to decipher what the original fragments are. And I think fragments have such a important place in today's world. And that's why, for example, when we look at the poetry of Safra, for example, it doesn't exist in its entirety, it exists in fragments, and you read translations of it today and it feels like contemporary literature.
Because you make out a new sense out of it.
If you give a printout to someone who has never heard of Safra, they read it, they will immediately say this is definitely contemporary. And I think, yes, and I think this idea of fragments has been in and out of art history for a very long time. You go back to, again, Greek architecture, almost designed to appear beautiful in ruins.
Exactly. Yeah, I cannot miss to mention the romantic sort of the awakening,
which is exactly that.
And I know it's one of your soft spots.
Yes, it is. So exactly the same with romanticism. That's why I said in and out. So we go back then with romanticism. It's all about trying to almost unhinge art and architecture and nature to see what happens when things are violently put up against each other.
Exactly.
And
the ravages of time.
And what happens when you document it. Yes, exactly. So even if you look at, for example, romantic architecture or even romantic fashion, costume history, we're presented with artifacts that are inspired by ruins and ruinism, or perhaps with the objective that they will one day return to ruins. So
because it's like going back to,
and that is the beautiful thing with romanticism, and I think
this fits a lot in your work.
Yes, even in my work, especially. Yes, there's fragmentation and constant awareness of death and decay and mortality, which is, of course, what this is all about. These imprints of almost like a.
I think we can feel some sort of loss.
Exactly, a friendly reminder of what has been lost and what is yet to be lost.
Exactly.
Perhaps.
Or to be found.
Or to be found. And you can't not speak of the visual links because of the tactility between this and, for example, cave painting. The act of marking something in your vertical state, first of all. And there's this sense of violence, not, when I say violence, I don't mean gore or bloodshed, but speed. There's this sense of violence,
the spontaneity.
Yes, exactly.
The creative act.
Yes, and perhaps that's why you said you were freer in your larger works, because you have to be quicker to cover such a big.
In fact, I do it quite fast.
Yes, you can see the speed, and I think speed is very important as well, because when something is overworked, then you can't really say it's about fragments. Fragments are sort of like quick comings and goings and ravages, and I think the fact that you look at something and you can almost feel, you can almost touch the expedited process through which it was created, I think that is quite lovely, and it's also very rare to look at an artwork and feel or be moved by or be sort of propelled forward through the speed of the act of what is sort of marked or decoded into the action.
What is your experience when you create a dress? Speed is somehow limited.
Yes, exactly.
How's your experience with time?
So I think that is dealt with through the processes of deconstruction and not exactly construction. So what I do love doing, especially when I'm working on my own and not collaborating with clients or other artists, is that through a sort of methodological costume history approach, I decode garments. So essentially, I take them apart, I recreate them, take them apart, take the blueprints, take the patterns in order to reassemble them, recreate something new.
Okay.
Now, obviously, the recreation part in fashion is what takes a very long time. It takes days and days. But that act of deconstruction and
fundamental.
Yes, and mental construction before you actually start is the quick part. That's the part which is violent.
Exactly. And then the construction phase is sort of a second.
Exactly. Then that can take its time.
But like complexity is sort of.
Exactly. Then you can take it apart very quickly again, but to put it back together, it's different because there's also this duality in fashion. Now, I mean, fashion out of all of the applied arts, I think, is the one which appeals to the most people, which
it is a popular.
Exactly. Not just because it's popular, but everyone understands it. Fashion is not a highbrow art.
It's something we all wear.
Exactly. It's something which even in the most remote places of every country, there's always someone who knows something more about the technique than you do, you know? It's almost a universal language because we've been putting on garments for
as opposed to painting, for example.
I think
especially
fashion predates marketing.
And even the sort of the Western approach, sort of how it has molded the idea of painting into like an exhibit in a gallery or in a museum.
Exactly.
That has somehow, I think, we lost that sort of.
Yes, whereas fashion is on exhibit from day one, immediately.
Exactly.
So it's different because of this, because it's understood by so many people, it's almost a bit more difficult.
You're more responsible.
Yes,
you're more responsible.
You have to be more responsible because the outcome is there to be digested, deciphered sometimes, and even taken apart by your audiences, which are not restricted to a gallery. So it's a very sort of, you feel like you're in precarious ground. It's a treacherous position.
It's interesting because unless you speak to a fashion designer like yourself, I mean, you can't fully understand these sort of mechanics.
And as much as you'd like to put the garments behind the glass in the right framework, you can never do so.
There was one particular garment which I remember you proposed as a work of art. You know which one?
Yes, actually. But yeah, so it's interesting because I was always looking at placing fashion within the art framework then. And it's a bit like what you're doing here, you're placing domesticity, maybe, or maybe
I'm almost reversing the thing. I mean, I'm putting in frame something which is taken from earth, from.
And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but this is the first collection I've seen where all of the artworks are framed.
It could be, yes, because I worked a lot of.
There was always a moment when there was something just on a piece of wood,
or just stretched to canvas, stretcher or something.
Exactly, or
these are not just framed, but also signed. You know, it's sort of exactly.
Which is really beautiful because the process itself of creating things like this is a bit like creating a lithograph, no?
Exactly.
So perhaps that's why they need to sign and to write. So.
Yes, somehow it reminds me of, for example, of how Christoph, for example, presented his blueprints, signed in a tragic. Because for some time I was, I didn't sign my work because I followed Roland Barthes' sort of approach in sort of the villain of the artist, in which the viewer becomes the sort of the author of the.
But what is particularly interesting is that with every signature, there is a date. And there's a date not just to commemorate when you created it, but to commemorate when you intervened.
It's a reference to time and space.
Exactly. So the actual date is as important as the artwork because it's like taking the photo, no?
It is.
With the date.
It reminds me of places and spaces.
Exactly. So you have to.
And smells. Some of them, for example, I did in Old Jerusalem. It was an amazing experience we were speaking about the senses. It was not just the visual, but also the tactile and the smells of the.
Again, which is why it's
you're the souk.
You're speaking of the five senses through black and white imagery with red markings. And I think to be able to do that, you need to have dedicated a lot of time to a project like this. And as you said, these are just
Some
a part of
it's a selection
of an exercise.
I thank you a lot, Luke, for accepting my invitation for this conversation. It has been really a very nice experience. And
my pleasure. Thank you. Thank you very much.